In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. In this season of Epiphany, have an epiphany. Be an epiphany. Well, first of all, we have to decide what an epiphany is. It's a little difficult sometimes when we're looking at the season of Epiphany, because for us mainly it is a visit of the wise men, the three kings. They probably were neither kings nor wise, and there probably weren't three of them, but that's another story. But what is Epiphany? Is it just the arrival of those three persons bringing homage to the baby Jesus? And he really wasn't a baby. He was a toddler at this time. But that's another story. What is it? What is Epiphany? Well, we think we've got it all figured out with the wise men until we hear about that thing going on at Tarpon Springs. And those 16 to 18-year-old guys are jumping in the water to retrieve a cross, and so we determine, well, it must have something to do with baptism. And yet there are places in Christendom that it has to do with the wedding at Cana. What indeed is Epiphany? Did you know you can have an epiphany without being religious? Anyone can have an epiphany. It's just a manifestation, a revelation, a brilliant insight that comes to you that says, oh, yes. If it were a comic strip, it would be a light bulb up there. Oh, okay. And yet, if it's a religious epiphany, and particularly Christian, then we understand it as a manifestation of Jesus, as he revealed himself to the Gentiles and as a message to everyone that Jesus wasn't just for the Jews, but the salvation was available to all who would come. Well, that's that epiphany. But can we, in the seas of an epiphany, have our own epiphany? And what could it be? Let me suggest. Love God. Love your neighbor. And you know, if you get the second part of that right, it's hard to get the first part wrong. Because it's what it's all about, isn't it? How we treat each other, and how we then show the way we treat each other to be our respect for God and our worship for God and our adoration of God. Love God. Love your neighbor. What if that could be our epiphany because we understood exactly how to go about it? Say, I don't know how to go about it. That may be the way an epiphany works, but then how do you put it into practice? Well, let's look at the three wise men. Let's look at how that epiphany worked. First of all, they had to move. They had to move fast. They had to begin. Sometimes beginning is so difficult. We get wonderful ideas, but to give those ideas legs is another matter. We tend to think wonderful things that we can do, but we sometimes don't get around to doing them. You see, those wise men had to move. They understood, because they were scientific people, and I think probably more scientific than actually religious people. They understood that if they were going to find this Messiah, this king, that they must then follow the star. Right then. They couldn't ponder it. They didn't have time to form a committee. They couldn't really look at all of the pros and the cons. They had to find a camel and mount it and start. You see, that's the problem with the wonderful epiphanies that we have. They don't become epiphanies because we never begin them. How many great ideas have you had that have never come to fruition And you think back and you say, I had that idea 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I haven't done a thing about it. Wow. Begin now. And begin in our relationship with each other. Because our relationship with each other determines our relationship with God. How do we treat each other? Sometimes a little bit shabbily. Og Magdino had a wonderful book called The 17 Principles. And principle number 10 I love. Principle number 10 says, live life by playing the game. And the game is, I've got a secret. And the secret is, I know you're going to die before dawn. The secret is you understand in your mind that this person is living their last day on earth. Now, how are you going to treat them? Friend or foe, how are you going to treat that person? Perhaps differently from how you would treat them ordinarily. This is their last day. Even those people you don't like, you're going to be nice to. You're not going to be mean to somebody if they're going to die in a few hours. Are you? Most are not. Yet we sometimes don't realize that if we would go that extra step, how much more we would listen to other people. How much more we would empathize with other people. How much we would care about what they care about. Begin now. Begin now with being able to say, I really care about you because you are a child of God. And because you're a child of God, I'm going to treat you that way. What if we began right now just acknowledging God? As if we had only one day to live. You see, it makes all the difference if we could begin now. And what about the work that is to be done in the church? So much work to be done for God that can be done in the church because we can work together in the church. It's a program called Alpha coming up. And basically it just teaches people the very simple facts regarding Christianity. It teaches people how to go to another person and say, God loves you. And there are many people who would find that to be a revelation, who never really internalized God loving them. And because of you, who would take the time to do that. There's a lot of people here today, but you know, there's some people that would be scared to come into the church. Because there's a lot of stuff goes on in the church they don't understand. And a lot of people who are in the church, they're all stuck up. They don't care about me. How can we reach those people? Begin now. Whatever you're going to do, begin now. Because you don't have that much time left. And when they're doing your memorial service, someone may say, he or she intended to do this. That's wonderful. They had wonderful intentions. You see, now is the time that we can change that. Not next week, not next month, not next year, but now. The first thing we need to understand, if we have an epiphany and we're going to make an epiphany, that we have to begin now. The second thing is, and the lesson we learned from the wise men, is you have to give the very best you can. Give the best to each other. Isn't it interesting how our best is reserved for certain people? Not everyone gets our best. Why not give the best to everyone? The wise men came and they gave their very best. No greater substance on the face of the earth, even to this day, probably is gold. They brought gold. One of the most expensive even then. They brought frankincense. It was expensive because it was rare. You could only get it from Africa and Asia, and only certain parts of Africa and Asia could you find it. And then you would only find it in the barks of certain trees. And then only certain people could harvest it. It had to be people who had, there's just no nice way to put this, it had to be people who would refrain from sex. Only those could gather the frankincense. At the time they called it no impurities, but that's what they meant. And myrrh, you know, you could take one little drop of myrrh and put it in a perfume that's entirely worthless, and it would become one of the most valuable perfumes in the world. Myrrh was used in embalming. And I think it was 1922, 23 when they went into King Tut's tomb. And the people who went in were overcome by the smell of the myrrh. Wow. They couldn't have brought anything any more valuable. They brought the very best they could be. Can we bring the very best we can be to each other and to God? Got to admit, sometimes God gets seconds. God gets what's left over. Yes, God, you know, I would, but gosh, you know, there's just so many things that I have to, yeah. And God says, here we go again. I understand. But if we're going to have an epiphany that makes an epiphany, we're going to have to begin right away with the very best we have to others and to God. And the third thing we need to do, if we have this epiphany, to create an epiphany, is to be able to have plan B. Have a plan B. Because you see, sometimes what we make up our minds to be the truth may not be the truth. And the ironic thing is, it might have been the truth earlier, but it's not the truth now. It may be that circumstances need to change as God directs, because God will give insight as you progress. So, that's why I say the wise men probably weren't very wise. You noticed in the story, they ended up in Jerusalem. Now, if they had just studied more, if they had just understood more, they would have known what was told them right away. It's not Jerusalem. It's Bethlehem. It's up the road. They're not far apart, you know. But what a mess they created by going to Jerusalem. And this is why I say they probably were not directed by God at all. They weren't listening to God at all. You know, they looks good on a Christmas card. But the facts are, they didn't wise up until the last minute. When they got there and the powers that be said, oh, so you're looking for this Messiah. When you find him, you come and tell me, I want to worship him. Yeah, sure they did. Jesus would not have lived the night. But you see, because they got it all stirred up, there was a slaughter of the innocents that came. Innocent babies, well, young kids actually, slaughtered, trying to find the one that was to be the Messiah and put that one to death, just slaughter them all. But the point is, at the last, the wise men did get a message from God and did listen and did change their plans. And when they did, they said, we got to go back a different way. We're not going to do as we promised. We're not going to go back and say where this young child is. We're going to leave it a different direction. We're going to change the plans that we'd made. You know, even Luke Skywalker changed his plans. He had intended, and those who were counseling him said to kill Darth Vader, but, well, I won't ruin it for you. But that was in a galaxy far away. And this is here, and this is now. But you know, in this season of Epiphany, what a wonderful time to have an epiphany. What a wonderful time to be